get a good feeling, yeah. Oh, sometimes I get a good feeling, yeah. Get a feeling that I never had before. No, I get a good feeling, yeah. Just wanna tell you right now, I really do believe it. Just wanna tell you right now, I really do believe
Okay, so it's 5 past now, so I think we'll make a start with the talk. Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for today's talk. My name is Gemma and I am one of the Cortex Club social secretaries. We are delighted to be hosting our speaker Ashley Juavinett for today's Growing Up in Science talk. Before we begin, I would just like to highlight some technical aspects of today's talk. So please mute your microphone for the duration of the talk, so not to disrupt the speaker. By attending our online events, you consent to the distribution of images resulting from this event for promotion of Cortex clubs, social platforms, and website. Please be aware that this event is currently being live streamed on YouTube. If you are concerned about your privacy, we remind you that you can change your name displayed in the video call or chat, hide your webcam, and also interact for questions exclusively via the chat, and we can read them for you. If you would like to ask a question, please use the raise hand function or type the word question into the chat. I will then call on you to unmute your mic and ask the question. If you prefer not to speak or you do not have a microphone, please type your full question into the chat and I will read it for you instead. Okay, so Growing Up in Science is an initiative started by Professor Wei Ma and Professor Christina Alberini at New York University. It is a conversational series featuring personal narratives of becoming and being a scientist, with a focus on the unspoken challenges of a life in science. We are delighted to welcome our speaker for today's talk, Ashley Juavinett. Ashley received her degree in neuroscience from Lafayette College in 2011. She went on to pursue a PhD in neuroscience at UC San Diego in Ed Callaway's group. In 2016, Ashley moved to Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory to work with Anne Churchland on innate behaviors in freely moving mice. She then became an assistant teaching professor in neurobiology at UC San Diego in 2018, where she teaches, writes, and co-directs the BS/MS and START Neuro programs. In 2020, she published her first book, So You Want to Be a Neuroscientist, which is a guide for aspiring scientists who are curious about our field. Having just read the book myself, I can highly recommend it to anyone studying neuroscience. So without further ado, I will hand over to Ashley and we can hear her unofficial Growing Up in Science story.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gemma. It's really an honor to be a part of this series. I actually saw Wei Ma give his talk when I was a postdoc and thought it was so cool. It was the first time I had heard of the series. So it's really fun to be here today. And this was just a really fun talk to think about and to put together. So you'll notice a lot of the talk is going to be photos. A lot of the photos are from these periods of my life. So it's a little bit of sort of a photo journal too. So hopefully you're a visual person like I am. I can appreciate that. So yeah, so this is me as a small kid. I didn't quite grow up in science. None of my family members are scientists, but I did grow up with people who were kind of curious. My grandfather, who you see here, would set up these sort of like things for me to play with. And I think we're like playing with cars on a ramp or something here. And similarly, my dad would make these like low tech things that I would drill into or build or whatever it was. So I kind of did grow up just being curious about how the world works. And I think that in a lot of ways is sort of foundational for wanting to be a scientist. So of course, today's about two stories, right? And what you'll see on my resume is the things that Gemma just talked about. So I have a BS and a PhD in neuroscience. I did a postdoc. I'm now an assistant teaching professor and just wrote my first book and published it. But what I want to tell you about today is sort of the stories underlying each of these steps. So as a college student, learning lessons from people with different upbringings, as a PhD student, diving into neuroscience without really even knowing what neuroscience was, as a postdoc, grappling with different personal and sort of professional choices during that time, as an assistant teaching professor, kind of finally finding a flexible professional home and sort of checking some boxes for me. And then finally, most recently as an author, trying to write a book about it all and trying to reflect on all these steps and see, you know, what were the implicit things that I learned that I would like to make explicit for other people. And that's something I want to try to do for this audience today as well. So my parents are not scientists. My parents are a daycare provider, and my dad was an IT specialist at the library. He has since kind of retired a little bit early. I grew up in a background of a lot of people struggling with depression and anxiety. You'll see my grandma on the right here. She was a really amazing artist, but also someone who was bedridden actually most of the time with really crippling anxiety. And for me, this was something that I found motivating in terms of trying to understand why these things were happening in my family and are still really happening to this day and are still very much a motivating part of me wanting to do science and wanting to train others to do science. So I decided when I was a high school student that I wanted to do either science or engineering. And I ended up at a place called Lafayette College. Lafayette College is a small private liberal arts school. It has 2,400 students. It's a very old college. It's also predominantly white and predominantly upper class, which I was very much not. I mean, I'm white, but I was not upper class. So I learned a few things here reflecting back. One thing is I learned how to ask for what you want and try to expect that you'll get it. So Lafayette was one of those colleges where you could design your own major and do your own research, and everything was very independent. And for me, that was all very much new. And sort of this idea that you could just ask for things and try to make them happen was very much new. And I feel like that was something I learned at a place like Lafayette, which is kind of like a little bit of sort of an experimental space for students trying to like design clubs and design majors and all of these different types of things. I also learned the value of hands-on mentorship. So looking back at my time as a liberal arts sort of student, I got a lot of feedback from professors. And for me, that was extremely important. I worked one-on-one with someone on an honors thesis. I talked a lot with professors. And so now as a professor, I really value those kind of one-on-one connections. And that's something that I got in this small environment that a lot of students don't get in a bigger environment. I also learned how to lead small groups of people. I was really involved in things like student government and stuff like that, which, you know, might sound weird for someone who is also interested in science, but this is the kind of thing actually that later on has ended up being really useful, because I went through things like diversity training. I went through like management training for leading different groups. And otherwise, as a scientist, as you know, you don't really get that kind of training all the time. And so, you know, actually these things that I learned in college have turned out to be really useful now. And the last thing is just how to eat at fancy restaurants. I grew up in a family that was very Italian American. We ate pasta 3 times a week. We didn't eat any Thai food. My parents won't touch sushi with a 9-foot stick. Like I learned how to just kind of be a little bit more cultured in a way and sort of stretch my comfort zones. And you know, this is important kind of in any professional sphere, because you go out to dinner with speakers, you have to know how to order, you have to know how to tip, and all these things that I really didn't learn as growing up. And so I really did learn these things from the people around me when I was at college. When I was in college, I also did some research, and I want to tell you a little bit about the research I did, because it's very different than what I'm doing now. And it's sort of, it's funny how I got to where I am now, I think. So my very first research experience was through the Learn program. This was with an alum at from Lafayette College. And I was putting rats on a hot plate to try to understand whether their pain tolerance changed because of being exposed to opioids prenatally. So does prenatal opioid exposure change your pain tolerance? And during the summer research, I actually didn't fall in love with research. It wasn't a story of like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I actually thought it was really difficult, but I was really intrigued by the researcher lifestyle, like this idea that you could travel. We didn't travel in my family very much. So the idea that you could just travel anywhere and give talks. Now we give talks over Zoom, but same deal. So I thought that that was really cool. And I thought the flexibility was really cool. And it was really the first time I had ever even considered doing something like being a scientist and sort of learning what being a scientist was like. My second summer in college, I didn't do neuroscience research at all. I actually moved to Santa Cruz for the summer and worked at a women's facility for a minimum security facility for the Santa Cruz County Jail. And this was really important for me. I did this kind of work when I was in college as well. And I started learning a little bit more about what I'll sort of call civic-minded research, really like sociology, and the idea that, you know, research can serve many different needs. So I was learning that neuroscience research could obviously work on drugs and things like that, like treatments, but also that we could do civic-minded research to try to understand how we can help people and something a little bit more applied. I also fell in love with California during the summer. It was the first time I had really been there, and that was really important for me too. And so this experience has kind of given me an orientation of always looking for the bigger picture and always trying to figure out who you're helping in the end. And working with the women in this facility was really, really important for me, I think, in my development in terms of just understanding neurological diversity and also the sort of societal implications of that diversity and how that plays out in our justice system. The final summer research that I did was at Columbia through the Amgen program, and I was doing things like in situ hybridization, looking at motor neuron development. I learned that I do not like molecular biology at all. I'm very much a visual and tactile person, and so I did not like that if you can't see things, then it's very hard for me to kind of like understand it. Molecular biology, of course, is all that. You do 16 steps and then you know, do an assay, and then all of a sudden your protein's not there and you're like, you know, what happened? So I learned that I didn't like molecular biology, so I started steering away from that. And during my senior year at Lafayette, I did an honors thesis that was totally opposite end of the spectrum in neuroscience from that. So I was actually doing eye tracking and skin response to try to understand if there were differences in the way people looked at crime scenes based on whether they were a Black or a white offender. And so you can see some of my data here where people are looking at, you know, the face of the offender or the gun and things like that. And so this helped me kind of tie a lot of these things together in a way that said like, okay, I want to do research that is ultimately maybe going to help people or inform our treatment of some of these social issues. And I really don't want to do molecular biology. So trying to figure out a place for all of these things. So when I left college, I sort of had three options in front of me. On one hand, I thought maybe I would do something like the Peace Corps, and I applied to the Peace Corps. I got an assignment to teach science in sub-Saharan Africa, and eventually kind of chickened out, honestly. I wasn't 100% ready for that, and I was also sort of being pulled towards grad school. And so on the grad school side of things, I applied to a dual degree program in public policy and a PhD, as well as just pure neuro PhD programs. And I was really drawn to the dual degree program, thinking, you know, maybe I want to sort of straddle neuroscience and public policy, thinking back to my sort of experience teaching in jail, but ultimately decided, okay, I need to like stop trying to be a liberal arts person my whole life and really sort of focus in on one thing. And so I thought, okay, I'll get a neuroscience PhD and sort of get the scientist stamp, and then go on and maybe do something with that. And so in my graduate school essays, this is the quote that I put on the top of my grad school application, which looking back is kind of embarrassing because it's very bold to start your grad school essay with a quote like this. But the quote is from Santiago Ramón y Cajal, and he says, "There is every reason to believe that when the human intellect ignores reality and concentrates within, it can no longer explain the simplest inner workings of life's machinery or of the world around us." And so what I think he's saying here is, you know, we have to be in touch with what's going on in the world. And even scientists who are trying to understand how the brain works have to be in touch with the world at large. And so for me, when I was entering grad school, I was thinking about my family, thinking about the women I had worked with in Santa Cruz, and trying to figure out if I could be a scientist who was also aware of the world around me. And so I graduated from Lafayette College. I had literally very little idea of what neuroscience was. Like, you'll notice I've never been exposed to systems neuroscience. I knew nothing about computational neuroscience. I barely knew cognitive neuroscience. I had these little slivers of sort of understanding, and I went into a PhD program. And the first year of my PhD was very illuminating because I did rotations and learned quite a bit more about what neuroscience actually was. I thought maybe I would do something like study drug addiction using fMRI, and that's actually the first rotation that I did, and I almost joined that lab until I rotated in the Callaway lab. And I rotated in the Callaway lab actually because people spoke really highly about Ed as an advisor. I knew very little about the science. I'd never done a mouse surgery. I'd never done imaging or anything like that. I'm super thankful that Ed was very willing to take me in and train me up. And I immediately fell in love with this kind of science. I had been feeling really frustrated with fMRI in terms of not being able to know what neurons were doing. You know, the sort of resolution of fMRI just wasn't really satisfying. And so when I was doing experiments like this and could literally just see neurons on the screen, that was extremely satisfying to me. So as a graduate student, I learned a few different things. So I learned the power of circuit mapping and modern neuroscience techniques that I really hadn't been exposed to at all as a college student. I learned how to code, which was actually extremely important, as many of you probably know, and is still serving me to this day. I spent probably the bulk of my time in grad school, honestly, deciphering other people's code and trying to learn how to code. And then finally, I learned the importance of mentors who will look out for you. So Ed is a really tremendous mentor. He is the kind of person who, you know, he doesn't care if you go into academia or if you leave academia. He was very supportive across the board, and someone who will write emails on your behalf to mentors and things like that. And I'm extremely grateful to him for that. I had to stay sane during graduate school, so I did quite a few other things outside of the lab. I was in a band, and these are my bandmates that I worked with in graduate school. So this was actually a huge part of me just being a person and reminding myself that I was still a person in addition to being a scientist. And I want to give a special shout out to this guy, Ethan McBride, because he and I would carpool actually a lot of times to lab and go back and forth. He's also in the Callaway lab. He's now at the Allen Institute. And on most days, we would kind of ask ourselves a question when we left the lab, and we would ask, is it a pro academia day? So we would kind of leave and think like, okay, like, was today good or bad for academia? And every day we would have that conversation when we were driving back from lab. And that was actually extremely helpful because it helped us keep in touch with like, okay, you know, if I'm feeling good on 70% of days, you know, maybe we can try out academia and it feels okay. Or maybe I'm just really frustrated with research most of the time. And so really this isn't for me. And so for me, like having a person to sort of bounce those ideas off of and sort of see and check in how we were feeling was actually extremely important for figuring out what I wanted my next steps to be. I think the things that I also learned during grad school, you know, wasn't really about the research necessarily. I mean, the research is obviously really important, but really the research is just one part of it. And so a lot of it was about skills and network. And so this is a quote from a book that I think is really nice about sort of life outside of academia and moving on after academia. And it says, PhD students rest all their hopes in a completed dissertation as a magical talisman of scholarly success, unaware that it is scarcely more than a union card. So I think when you're in graduate school, it can feel like your PhD, like your dissertation is like the most important thing and you have to get it done and you have to get your papers out. But for me, at least, I found that all of the other things I was doing outside of my research actually ended up being just as important as the research itself. And so a couple of those things were writing with a group called Neurite San Diego. So this is a group actually that started in New York, and then we started a branch in San Diego. There's a few different branches across the country, and I think actually in London as well. And we wrote different stories about neuroscience. We edited each other's writing, and this actually turned out to be an extremely formative experience for me. The second thing was I did a lot of teaching when I was in graduate school. I taught in various high schools, and I also taught a summer class as the instructor at UCSD. And this was extremely important for me because I learned that I like teaching, and I learned that I liked the balance of going into lab and then going to teach, and then going into lab and going to teach. And I felt that that sort of was mutually beneficial for both sides of things. So this is about halfway through the story. So I want to maybe just pause here before I dive into my postdoc to see if there's any questions or anything right now. And thanks to those of you who are saying hi in the chat. It's really nice to see you guys. Okay, great. So let's talk about postdocs then. So I got to the end of my time as a graduate student, and I was starting to think about postdocs. This was maybe year 4 or something. And I went to this workshop for the Dynamic Brain, which is hosted by the Allen Institute for Brain Science, seeing the list of faculty on it and feeling like, oh, there's a lot of amazing faculty here that I would like to maybe meet. And one of those faculty was Anne Churchland. And on the very first day, I actually remember I walked into sort of the cabin. This is Friday Harbor, and so there's all these cabins there. And I walk into the cabin, I see Anne, I just like beeline for Anne. I'm like, okay, I need to talk to her. And I basically walk up and I just say like, hi, I'm Ashley. You know, I work in the Callaway lab. I love your work. And Anne immediately comes back with like, hi, Ashley, what do you think of this? And shows me a retinotopic map of a mouse. And I was immediately like, okay, cool. Like I can talk science with this person and she respects my opinion. Like she was like, oh yeah, Callaway lab, great. Like you do this research. What do you think of this map? And just literally pulled up a map on her computer. And I thought that was really rad. And I really got to know Anne a little bit during the conference and then over SFN, and eventually decided that I would join her lab as a postdoc. And so I learned a few things as a postdoc. So I learned how to design and carry out a project, you know, really the first time I got to do that really on my own. How to mentor others. I worked with several summer students, and I'm super grateful to have worked with them. They're amazing, and really, I think, helped me as a postdoc before becoming a professor really sort of figure out what my mentoring style was and how I could try to pass on some of the lessons I had learned onto other people. And then finally, more about the importance of mentors, and especially for Anne, people who care about lab culture and diversity. Anne is the kind of person who creates environments for people to succeed in, and I think that that's incredibly important. Anne also cares a lot about diversity, and if you look at her lab, you'll notice that it is very diverse, and people come from all kinds of places, and I think that that's incredibly important and something that I respect Anne for quite a bit. I learned a few other things during my postdoc, and I was actually far from my partner at this time, so this was really, really hard. We were long distance. She was in San Francisco, I was in New York. We tried to keep it together, right? We did like these baking nights while we were apart where we would bake the same thing. But you know, this was really hard, and maybe this sounds really simple, but of course I didn't want to be far from my partner. I also didn't want to be geographically restricted, so I was starting to already feel the sort of hands of academia like gripping me and like feeling like, okay, I can't move anywhere I want because there's not always going to be a job for me, right? And that was starting to feel very real at this time. So that was starting to set in. I was also starting to tune a little more to the fact that I didn't really, that I was more drawn to non-research tasks. So I was much more drawn to things like teaching and science communication and science writing and editing. So I was working with this group called Guerrilla Science. I was also working with a group called Massive Science. They do science writing and editing. And what I started realizing is I would show up to lab and I'd have like two tasks in front of me. I'd have like, you know, a mouse surgery and electrophysiology experiment to do, or I'd have like a piece to edit that someone had written. And I would immediately want to edit the piece that someone had written. Like I did not want to do the mouse surgery. I was not really excited to do the experiment. And so I started tuning into that a little bit more and thinking, okay, what if I actually just did the things that I wanted to do? And what if I actually got to write full time or edit full time or teach full time? And I started thinking maybe that's actually a possibility. And so I sort of was talking to people and trying to get a sense of, you know, what kind of jobs were like that. I was also stretching my legs in science communication a little bit more. So I did this stand-up thing, which I don't know if I'll ever do stand-up again, but this was at least a really good experience. But really starting to see that there were ways that I could be creative in science that spoke to my creative side of things. And that for me was really, really good to see. And I started seeing research as limited in that way. Of course, research requires some creativity, but it's not quite the same. And then finally, I started feeling the numbers really creeping in, right? And so the numbers of who gets a faculty job look something like this. So, you know, maybe about 15% of PhD graduates find tenure track roles. Another 18% find non-tenure track positions. If you do a postdoc, your percentage is higher. So I was in a postdoc, so about 27% of biologists that do a postdoc get a faculty job, but we're still only talking about a quarter, right? And if you look at specific programs, you can get numbers from something like 22 to 30%. So the numbers are tough, right? They're not impossible. I think it's important to just be realistic about them, right? So 1 out of 4 people who do a postdoc will get a tenure track faculty job. And so this started sort of creeping in as well. And in addition, the sort of geography question, for me, I was thinking liberal arts schools or something with a sort of undergraduate component, not necessarily an R1, which might have a higher percentage of success, but means that I'm geographically restricted to wherever those liberal arts schools are. And they're not necessarily in LGBT friendly places. They're not necessarily in a place where my partner could get a job. So all these things sort of started swirling together. And at that point, I sort of narrowed it down to a few boxes that I needed to check. I needed a place where my partner and I actually wanted to live and a place that felt safe for us. I needed some degree of creativity and intellectual freedom. I started realizing that that was really important for me. And then I also really wanted a job that involved communicating about science to either students or the public, because I felt like I enjoyed it in both of those spheres, and either one of those spheres would have been rewarding. And so I was kind of in this place where I was choosing between, you know, what's familiar and sort of some vague unfamiliar thing, like some combination of teaching and writing that I wasn't really sure like what that would look like. And I didn't intentionally put the academia on the sort of dirty door here, but, you know, I was sort of like intrigued about what this other door had behind it, even though it was completely new and sort of vague, uncharted territory. And then someone sent me an email and forwarded me this neurobiology teaching professor position at UC San Diego. And this is literally email. I forwarded it to my partner. Just like, oh my God, this sounds really cool. And finally, maybe something is gonna check these boxes that we want to check. And maybe we'll get to move back to San Diego, where we really love. And I consider this an Oprah yes moment. And I think this is a really good frame decisions in your life. And this actually comes from one of my favorite podcasts called Dear Sugar. And Dear Sugar sort of takes in letters and then they respond to them. And they have one episode where they're talking to Oprah and they're like, Oprah, how do you make decisions in your life? Like, you must have a million opportunities. And, how do you say yes to some things and no to other things? And she sort of lays out a framework about, something has to make you really, really excited. And, that's the thing that you want to say yes to. And everything else, you probably don't want to say yes to. So now I have this thing where, if I feel really excited about it, it's an Oprah yes moment. And there's been a few of these in my life. And this was absolutely one of them. So it was like, yes, I want to apply this job. I started writing my application for this job basically the same day I saw it. And was extremely lucky to get this job. And so now I'm here in San Diego and I am doing a mix of things. And for me, this is checking all the boxes and it's kind of hitting these different spheres of my life in a way that I couldn't really have planned. I didn't even know about this job when I was a grad student. I didn't know about it really until the end of my postdoc. So I do some teaching, I do some service for the university, and I also do some scholarships. So I still get to write. I still do some research, some of it biology, most of it education research. And there's a few things I really like about my job right now. So I have colleagues who care a lot about teaching and diversity and actually really, really care. I live in a place that I love, and I used to feel shallow about saying, I want to live in a certain place, but look, truth of the matter is you get one life and you can either spend that in somewhere you want to live and where you feel safe or not. And I love living in San Diego and I'm very happy here. And that means a lot to me. And then finally, the freedom to write and create. So I have summers usually to do more writing and, freedom to create lectures, create curricula and things like that. And that's been extremely, extremely rewarding as well. And then one other Oprah yes moment came along. So around 2018, towards the end of my postdoc, if you're doing the math, I did just about a 2-year postdoc. I got an email from the editor at Columbia University Press who said, I follow you, I've read your writing. What do you think about writing a book? And I was like, yes, hands down, I want to do this. It might not have been like the book that I would have thought of, but he had a really clear idea, and Columbia Press was really thinking, okay, there's this guide for neuroscientists published by Santiago Ramon Cajal over 100 years ago. Neuroscience has changed tremendously since then. We need a new guide to it. And I was like, okay, great. So I took this on, I wrote a proposal, I thought about what the book would look like. And just this December, it was published. I will say I learned a ton from writing this. I learned about planning, or rather I learned what you shouldn't do for planning, which is you shouldn't wait until the last minute to edit your book because it takes a long time to edit 60,000 words. And so I learned a bit of humility about, how much you could write, how much, I think just being humble about what other people know. I wanted to approach this book in a way that wasn't like I was telling the field what to do, but rather I was a medium for what the field already thought. And so I learned a lot of humility through that. And I also learned about networking through the book as well. I talked to a lot of people. This still informs the way that I do my science writing. So I'm constantly trying to talk to people, figure out, what is the truth of the matter. And that requires a lot of networking and reaching out. And so, yeah. And so looking back, a few things I think have been really important for me. Of course, there's overcoming feelings of you don't belong here. And there have been so many instances of this. With the book, for example, a friend of mine actually said, why do you think you're the person to write this book? And that really hurt because I was like, I don't necessarily, right? But someone came to me and said, do you want to write this book? And I said, yes. And a lot of it has been trying to figure out like, okay, yeah, I'm someone who could write this book. I'm not the only person, obviously, and I'm not necessarily the best person, but I'm going to write it. And I belong here and I can do that. And so that's been a little bit of a lesson in that, many different research spaces I've had to feel like, okay, I belong here, and had to tell myself that. During my graduate school interviews, that's another example. Someone said, "Oh, you're not one of these like MIT, like Princeton kids, are you?" It's like, no, I'm not. And that's not the way you want to start an interview. So there's been a few moments of that. Of course, everybody has these moments. I'm sure you've had them as well, but there's definitely, some overcoming of that has had to happen. I think some listening to instincts. So, rather than trying to think, okay, what do I need to do to get to the next step? Or like, what is sort of my lab telling me, or what is academia telling me? Listening to actually what I was really enjoying, like listening to those moments where I would go to lab and want to write rather than do experiments, or want to teach rather than analyze my data, whatever it is. Listening to those things, I think, is really important. Talking about those desires to others is also really important. So when I was in my postdoc, I started, having these second thoughts about why I was in a postdoc and what I was going to do. And I started just talking to other people and telling them, I am looking for something that's like some combination of teaching and writing. And I actually talked to one person who I had worked with when I was a graduate student, and she was the first person to forward me actually that email with a job listing. And so that actually ended up being really important, because I had sort of said, okay, here's kind of what I want. And she was like, okay, like I'll let you know if I hear of anything like that at UCSD. And then turns out there was something like that. And so, if you don't tell anybody what you want, no one's going to know, no one's going to be able to actually tell you and help you out, right? This is really big. And so choosing environments over promised outcomes. So a lot of times, you might, if you're applying for postdocs or applying to jobs, there might be sort of this promise of what's going to happen. Oh yeah, you'll get a cell paper at the end of this, or like, you'll definitely get placed in a job because everybody gets placed in a job. Rather than choosing jobs or positions for that, I would choose the environment. So when you go there and you talk to people, what does it feel like? What's the mentorship style of the advisor? I think that's what I did for grad school. And I think that worked out. I chose UCSD because I really liked the students and I really liked the environment. And then I chose my rotation lab because people spoke really highly of Ed, and I felt like that was a space where I could learn and grow. And I had no idea what was going to happen at the end. And I, was really sort of going for the environment. And I think that that's incredibly important. And then finally, showing gratitude. So I think one thing that's really important is every step of the way to thank those who have made this possible. And so I'm extremely thankful to the mentors that I talked to you about today. I'm extremely thankful for my high school guidance counselor, who believed in me when I was growing up in Camden, New Jersey, and was like, oh yeah, you can do this, like you can go to college. And my dissertation is dedicated to her because of that. And so I think along the way, showing gratitude will always come back to you, and it's just important, I think, in the long run. So on that note, I will say thanks for having me. The book is out now. You can order it. There's a bit.ly link here. It's on Amazon and Columbia. And yeah, these are my follows if you want to follow me there. And I'm more than happy to chat and take questions. And yeah, thanks so much again.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ashley. That was really, really great. Yeah, so I think we'll take some questions now. If people have questions, feel free to write in the chat. You can either write a question or you can type out your question in the chat. Oh, someone's raised their hand. I can't see that.
Oh, it's Danby.
Oh.
I can see you.
Okay. Hi, Ashley. That was really great. Thanks for sharing that. I had a question earlier and wasn't able to figure out how to raise my hand. So I wanted to ask, what kind of music did you play in your band? And do you still play music? And how do we find that?
Great question. So with the band, we called it Soulcusta Papa Funk. So it was kind of a mix, we do like fun covers of like Bill Withers and Britney Spears and the Beatles and just like everything in between. So it was a lot of things. We were called the Dark Matter Turtles, which was a name that actually came out of like a slightly intoxicated retreat conversation. Um, but before that, actually, I've been playing as a singer-songwriter since I was in high school. And yeah, my music is at ashleyjmusic.com. I have not been playing a ton lately. You can see I actually made a quarantine purchase, which is an electric guitar, trying to learn some electric guitar. I haven't been performing a lot, but I'm trying to play and still keep active with it. Yeah, music for me has been basically the other sort of, you know, major identity that I've had throughout my life. And I think actually, like for me, I'm a little bit of an introvert naturally, but like performing has sort of taught me how to put on a little bit of a performing face, and that comes in handy a lot for teaching and everything else. And so like it's been really useful in those ways professionally too, in addition to just yeah, keeping me sane, as I said before. But yeah, thanks for asking.
Well, thank you for your answer.
Cool. I have a question actually. Ashley, in your book, I found the part about learning how to code and like convincing yourself how to code was very helpful and relatable. So I was wondering what your best advice for someone is who's like new to coding, and how they can kind of gain confidence and like convince themselves that they are a real coder despite not having that background.
Yeah, totally. This is super important. And I face this issue with my students a lot too, because they already have preconceived notions about coding, because they know that, you know, computer science classes are really hard to get into and they're notoriously very difficult to succeed in. So the things I tell my students are, you know, for one, no one's born learning how to code. You know, it's not like you wake up knowing how to code in Python. But it's a learned skill. So that's like thing number one. And the sort of interesting about coding, like if you want to tackle it from a neuroscience side of things, you know, people that have done these studies that, you know, stick people in fMRI scanner and look at like what brain areas are activated while people are coding, you know, it's not the math stuff and it's not really the language stuff. Like it's maybe some blend. So I think like, you know, reminding yourself that it's really just a different skill, and it's kind of a combination of different things, and no one's born knowing how to do it, and having a lot of patience. And the last thing is just sort of normalizing things like making mistakes. So I live code in front of my students a lot now, and I make mistakes and it's embarrassing. And look, I have to Google like my PyPlot every time I want to make a figure in Python, like, and that's just how it works. And so I think like, you know, reminding yourself that it's totally normal to need to like search for things, that you don't have just this like library of Python in your head, because why would you? Yeah, and also that people who code have been doing it for years and years and years, right? Like the people who are good at coding have years of experience under their belt. And so I think that's super important too.
Cool, thank you. Okay, Steph.
I had a quick question.
Oh.
Hi, Ashley. Thanks for the great talk, sharing your experiences with us. And it's surprising that I had to receive a Cortex Club invitation to realize you're so nearby in UC San Diego. And then this channel became the source of how I listen to you. And I checked your webpage, which has a very interesting set of resources for learning to code. So that's how I got interested in the talk also. I wanted to talk about the importance of teaching experience, that in teaching professor positions, how much emphasis is on having a certain amount of teaching experience and how much is enough for such positions.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so for my position, which I think, so I have teaching professor title, which is also lecturer with potential security of employment in some systems. And yeah, so there's this kind of position at R1 schools, but also some non-R1 schools as well. And I think for all of those, usually there's the minimum requirement is that you're instructor of record for a college class. And so for me as a grad student, I taught as an instructor of record one class during a summer at UC San Diego. And that's kind of like the bare bones minimum, I think. And so beyond that is great. You know, anything on top of that is great. The fact that I had taught in high school was, I think, really good and useful. But really the kind of minimum bar was like, you've actually taught a class as instructor of record at a college level. And I think that's required. So definitely more than being a TA, probably more than just, outreach or teaching in high school and that sort of thing. Yeah. For community colleges, it might be slightly different. So I think community college jobs are actually really great. And so, if you're someone who wants to teach full time, for one, there's many more community colleges in the world, and they're, at least in the US, they're all over the place. And yeah, those jobs are stable. For teaching experience for those, it might be slightly less. Like they might be willing to take on people who are a little bit new to teaching. That I'm not 100% sure about, but that's my intuition.
Thank you.
Good question.
Cool. We have some questions in the chat. I'll go to Steph first because I think she had her hand up. So Steph asks, teaching experience for those of us that have been mostly doing basic R1 research.
Yeah, great question. And hey, Steph, nice to see you.
Yeah, I think you mostly covered it. I was just going to ask basically the same question for those of us who have been mostly like running journal clubs or stuff like that, outreach, like, can you kind of, did you try to slant that at all towards like the teaching angle in your applications or?
Yeah, definitely. So I talked about everything in my application, like from the high school teaching that I did to outreach, to even things like, because when I was a postdoc, I wasn't teaching really at all. I was doing kind of these like very informal teaching experiences. I went and worked at a festival, like an art and science festival, the Oregon Eclipse Festival, and taught. And I was like, yes, that's teaching. So I was like trying to spin those things into, I think they are valid teaching experience, but kind of outside of the box of what is, typical. But I would say like if you're in an R1 research position, you don't have access to teaching through your institution. I don't know how this is in the UK, but if there are smaller schools around, community colleges or two-year colleges, a lot of those places will hire instructors. They might need just someone to teach biology for a quarter, and looking out for those jobs, that's definitely what I would do. Those are really great opportunities to kind of like try out the water and just get something under your belt that's like, yes, I've taught a college course. So that's definitely what I would do. So when I was at Cold Spring Harbor, like Cold Spring Harbor is just a research campus, but there's Stony Brook nearby. There's a couple community colleges nearby. And so I started getting a little bit looped into those circles, thinking, okay, like if I want to teach for a quarter and, if it's okay with Anne, then I can do that and kind of like get some more experience. Yeah.
Awesome. So Jimmy has asked, what advice would you give for getting out of the low moments during research/grad school?
Yeah, there's definitely low moments, right? I mean, this is true across the board. I mean, I wasn't immune to this at all. So, I mean, I think having something outside of lab, right, and the support group, and I know it's easy to say, get a support group, but like cultivating those relationships with people where you can be honest. I think that that's actually super important. So for me, it was my lab mates, but for you, it might be like people in your program or even just people outside of research at all. And the thing I think is really hard about research sometimes is because of the competition that comes along with this, like either competition between labs or, you might sort of implicitly feel like you're competing against other people. That holds people back from being completely honest about how their experiments are going and, what they're afraid about and things like that. And I think if you can get through those barriers with people, and at least find a couple people that you can be really honest with and, have the conversation that's like, I don't know if I want to be here, and have that conversation with, at least one other person, I think that can be extremely important. So there's sort of like a disclosure element. And I think for me, science is such an identity for many people, and it has this sort of feeling of like, you're grown, you're like born, and then you want to be a scientist, and then you're like totally a scientist to the end, and like you'll move anywhere and you'll do all these things, and it's like some core identity trait. And I think I never quite felt that way, and I always like was pushing against that a little bit. And I think it's really important to like keep other identities in your life that are just as valid as being a scientist, and also recognize that being a scientist is not always just doing lab work. Like I still consider myself a scientist. I still teach science. I'm still very active in the science world. And so, you know, there's more than one way to be a scientist, and there's more than one way to be a person. So like maintaining other identities, and maybe you lean on those other identities a little bit more when stuff's hard in research. Like, so for me, it was like music or being creative or, you know, things like that. And I think that that can be really helpful as well.
Yeah, totally. Okay, cool. Do we have any other questions? If anybody else wants to write in the chat or raise their hand? Oh, yeah. Did I just see one?
Like Madalena?
Hi, thank you so much. This is really helpful, and I just finished your book, and I really enjoyed it. So I just a bit like to go into teaching. How important you think is the publication record? Is it
That
something?
depends on the position, I think. So for UCSD, like for, and I think for the UC system in general, you know, they're looking for people who are like bona fide scientists. And, you know, it doesn't mean you have like a stellar publication record, but you have like, you know, one or two things where you're like one of the first authors on. So you got a publication in grad school, you got maybe a publication as a postdoc. So it's certainly, you know, way less than like applying to, you know, an R1 position. It's like not comparable. For liberal arts jobs, where you're going to run a research lab and you're going to teach, or like liberal arts, or let's say primarily undergraduate institution sort of jobs, they care a little bit more about teaching because about research, because you will be, you know, doing research and leading a lab. So I think that's still like a little bit less than R1 jobs, but actually they still care about that a lot. And then for like community college teaching or even like high school teaching, I don't think the publications matter at all. So I think you can have a lot of leeway there. Yeah. And I'll make a plug for teaching actually at high school. So I spent some time in grad school teaching at this group of high schools in San Diego, which are called High Tech High, and they're sort of project-based charter schools. And they're like really rad. And the people there seem really happy. And, you know, a lot of them have PhDs. They get their summers off. They do projects with students where they like set up 6 huge tanks of coral, and they test different conditions on the coral's growth and things like that. And so like, I mean, I think those jobs are really rad too. So I think, you know, thinking outside the box of like what, you know, you're like, oh, I want to be like at a place like this. Well, you know, consider community college and consider high schools. And I think that people are really happy in those places.
Cool.
I can ask you just a little bit. So when you get the position, did you get any formal training on actually teaching?
That's a good question. So there's plenty of opportunities for me at UCSD to improve my teaching, and especially in the community that I'm in, because I'm in a community of about 12 biology teaching professors. And so they're all really active in doing their own research. There are many education research conferences and things like that. And so there's a lot of sort of opportunities for me to either get direct training or sort of go to conferences and talk about, you know, how to teach and best practices and things like that. I took the job, the expectation when I took the job is like, you have some baseline level of like knowing how to teach. And in fact, I had to demonstrate that because for my job, I had to actually give a teaching demonstration as a part of the interview. So my interview was, you know, kind of like a research faculty job, except instead of the research talk, it's a teaching talk. So I actually taught a room of scientists about like a basic undergrad thing, and they have to kind of pretend like they're undergrads. This was very strange. And then my chalk talk was about the sort of scholarly work that I would do, the kind of service I wanted to be involved in, and that kind of thing. And also my perspectives on diversity and how like I was going to treat the classroom and all of my work with sort of a lens of diversity. And so yeah, so really you have to like, for my job, the expectation is, you know how to teach, you're coming in the door kind of knowing how, but there's always opportunities to grow. And one of the things I love about my job is just being in a community of people who really do care. And so if I'm ever like, you know, do you write your quiz questions with 3, you know, multiple choice answers or 4? People have tons of opinions about this, right? It's just like, I can immediately learn. And then, you know, the person who's been teaching for 20 years is like, look, here's the research on whether you should use 3 or 4. And there's always opportunities like that to learn. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Cool. Danby?
Yeah, sorry. The Madalena's question made me think of sort of a follow-up question. I was wondering, you mentioned that you also do research and that a lot of it has to do with research on education. What has that been like, and sort of what are the topics that you find most fascinating doing this kind of research?
Yeah, so this is kind of a pivot I've been making, right? So all of my training up till this point has been biology research. And then even in my like first year here, I was like still getting out some publications. And so now I'm kind of like pivoting into this world of education research. And so the things I want to really start working on, one of the main things is actually back to this issue of coding and like specifically teaching biology students how to code, because a lot of biology students actually chose biology sort of categorically because they were like, I am not a math person, but I like STEM, so I'm a biology person. And then they meet coding and they're like, wait, you told me this was biology. And so I've been really curious about sort of like developing best practices around teaching discipline-based coding. So really kind of like, user end programming, like biology students and neuroscience, whatever, like do not need to know the sort of core concepts of computer science. They need to know how to use it. And so something that I'm trying to do now is one, understand students' perceptions around coding from, specifically for biology students, because I think they are kind of like a unique population of students. And then two, figure out, okay, if they have those preconceived notions, coding is predominantly male, coding is something you start when you're in high school, coding involves math, whatever it is, how do we develop either interventions or just best practices around trying to, involve those students in the field, invite them in to say like, look, if you want to do neuroscience research or biology research, you have to, you have to actually get into coding a little bit and sort of feel it out a little bit for most of those jobs. So yeah, so that's something I'm thinking a lot about now. I'm also very much involved in trying to think about, this might not sound like research, but it's kind of institutional research, which is I direct this BSMS program. And so this is a program for biology students where they can continue on to get their master's. And in the US, doing a master's in biology is kind of unusual, right? In the UK, it's very typical. You do a master's before you do your PhD, but in the US, it's a little more uncommon. So I've been trying to figure out kind of like, what's the best thing we can do for those students, and where are those students coming from, and where do they get jobs? And so in a way, it's kind of more like sociology research, is like tracking these students and tracking their outcomes. Yeah, so these are things I'm thinking about these days. I think, ultimately, I'd love to get into sort of fun questions about how do we represent visual, like neuroscience information. I'm sort of curious about visual representation, broadly speaking, right? How do you teach these things in a way that doesn't have preconceived notions or misconceptions based on how you teach it? Anyway, I'm just rambling now, but there's a lot of things I want to do and limited time to do them.
Cool. Okay, do we have any more questions? Anybody else with their hand up? No.
I had a quick follow-up question.
Yeah, sure.
I was wondering, looking at the classroom teaching experiences, how I got interested in becoming a teaching professor someday. I'm in my postdoc right now, but in the last year, we have seen the transition from classroom teaching to the online mode of teaching. And is the enthusiasm still the same, or do you, how did you manage the transition, and was it equally exciting?
Yeah, the short answer is no. I mean, online teaching is really not the same. I've sort of developed my own strategies around keeping up my energy levels around it. The thing that's really hard is you don't get feedback. And in some classrooms, sort of depending on the students that are there, people will have their videos on, they'll be giving you a lot of feedback, and that's really great. But in most of the classes I've taught in the past year at this point, most students don't feel comfortable putting their videos on, or, they just don't for any number of reasons. And so it's really hard to like figure out where your students are, et cetera. So I think for me, the strategy has been thinking myself more as just like a YouTube SciCommer or something, like I just have to kind of generate the energy to like, to teach, right, without the feedback. And so it's just a very different mode. I'm really excited to get back to in-person teaching. I know that we still have a little while to go, but yeah, I mean, it's been hard. There's elements that I really like I especially actually teaching coding on Zoom is actually much easier because, you know, when students hit a snag, I can share my screen, they can see it really easily. If students hit some sort of snag, then I can just be like, okay, share your screen, let me see what you're doing. And that's much easier versus me like in the classroom looking over their shoulder, like trying to see what they're doing. So there's some elements that are just like logistically a little bit easier, but on the whole, yeah, teaching in person is just much better, especially because I teach this lab class where like we do intracellular recordings and leaches and we do EEG and EMG, and it's just like, yeah, we don't get any of that online. So, you know, I'm trying to find my joy in other places basically right now, because the joy is, you know, not always coming from the classroom. We are sending cockroaches home with students to do backyard brains recordings. That has been by far the best, like the height of my joy in this teaching. But yeah, it's hard online.
Cool. Okay, if we don't have any more questions, I think that's a good point to round things up. Thank you so much, Ashley, for coming and giving this talk. It was great and so useful for people to hear the unofficial stories in science. Yeah.
Yay. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, this has been really fun. And hi, Laura. And yeah, feel free to reach out if anybody has any sort of questions or anything. I'll put my email in the chat in case if you have anything else. Yeah, have a good night.
Have a good day.
Thank you.